Yes, is it on? Yeah. Two wonderful papers. A lot to say about this. Also in respect to what we saw this morning. I think all the discussions that we had, I'd like to pick up on, I'd like to start with the last contribution and then go back to Susanna's work. And the advantage of having a computer with me is actually that I can easily cut and paste from my previous work, which means that, because there was so much that you were saying that reminded me of what I've been also interested in over the past years. Done a lot of work on Michel Serres, and he's also very much interested in what Isabel Stengers is also focusing on, that what the role that Galileo plays in this history of nature. So I now can quote Michel Serres directly on this, because he nicely summarizes it, and it nicely links also to the three statements you made. So Serres says, this is in a long interview, a book together with Bruno Latour on science. He talks about the whole modern project and how this happened since Galileo. And he critiques Galileo for being, so Michel Serres critiques Galileo for being the first to put a fence around the terrain of nature, take it into his head and say, this belongs to science, and find people simple enough to believe that this is of no consequence for man-made laws and civil societies closed in on human relations as they are. End of quote. So I think this nicely summarizes your three statements, the whole idea of that modernism or the modern thought colonizes nature from the idea of bifurcation, localization, and some sort of abstraction or ideal. And my question would go to the last part of your statement, because although I sense a lot of capitalism in it and a lot of the state, the role of science is crucial here. So in what way has science been fundamental in implementing this idea of nature? So that will be my question to you, and to link it to your work, because I think that the kind of opening that you gave us at the end, so the idea of alive territories and the way in which we can rethink nature as a network of lives, really fits beautifully into the kind of work that you're doing and the way you're trying to show these. We've been talking about the missing people earlier, but the missing lives or the missing forms of life, all these microbes and plankton species which have just been off the radar because we didn't need them, right? Because it didn't fit our the concept of nature that we as moderns needed. So the first would be to you, and then to you.
So it works? Yes. Thank you very much. It's true that it's a beautiful summarized by Michel Serres. I like the idea that Michel Serres just summarized my talk. I like to see it in this way. In fact, I think he has a very good point, and which is we underestimate what happened in the laboratories, because we thought that it was experimentation, science. Of course, there is power relation in science and laboratories who can make the experimentation, the struggle between different type of science, physics, mathematics, biology, all this struggle. But it was something really stronger, as Simon Scheffer shows, is that the complete set of political categories will change through this specific gesture, and we don't interrogate it. So we struggle in a level where we don't identify the source of the problem, and the source of the problem were so specific in their gesture. So that's an element, and I think I can also add something through that, is the fact that when I read recently the book of Bruno Latour, The Different Mode of Existence, he tried to show that the moderns made a lot of mistakes of categories, reference to reproduction, politics and science, politics and aesthetics, etc. And I was a little bit surprised by the fact that it gives the impression that it's just mistake of categories. Like if they made something wrong and that we can change the articulation. I think they didn't do, it's worst. It had a pragmatic effect of domestication of realities. So I think that that's the point. And I will also add a last element to the question for the debate. Isabelle Stengers mentioned also the importance of the shift through Galileo. And she used an expression that you find in What is Philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari, a very strange expression that you have in geophilosophy, where Deleuze and Guattari say the principle of philosophy is the principle of contingent reason. And the contingent reason means that there is something contingent, which doesn't mean that it was purely hazard, purely chaotic. An event changed the situation. And you can all the time imagine that this event would have gone in other direction, but it went in this direction, and we inherit from this direction. So it's a way to say that in the same time, Galileo is a big event and a very precarious event, very fragile event that happens. You don't find all the rest of the story. I like the title, Hereafter, because you don't know what will be next. It happens, and as soon as it happens, we will be dependent of this gesture, but we cannot say that it was obvious that it will happen and that the consequences were necessary linked to this gesture or this event.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like tough to add something to this, but what I've been maybe missing, and thanks a lot for the summary, is like, you know, where should this go? And I've been also in some other works like very invested in, let's say, the criticism of modernism for various reasons, not only the progress idea, but a lot to do with like the female body or the concept of a body as well. But maybe what I can add that brings something else in there, that you know, with this criticism, it's not like, oh, now we're all like helpless and hopeless, but we also have like the tools for going further and doing what the, you know, in science fiction or speculative you call the what if. So we also have the chance to like, what if we think the future with like tons of perspectives that we, you know, where we see the border of our imaginary, let's say in my case with the dinoflagellate, but it's kind of like beautiful to hit that border and kind of be aware of like the limitedness of your own, and maybe the challenge to kind of go beyond that. Did that make sense? But
may I just add something? I think that the agenda, if you want, is to say that if you take too seriously the kind of narration that the modern invents, even if you want to refuse it, it will be too massive in the way to inherit from that or to criticize it, and you arrive to the catastrophic theories, etc., because you don't have any other resource to think, because we remove all the tools that you had at your disposition. My idea is that we have to go back to kind of genealogy process to fragilize all this invention, to be sure that they will be not too impressive, to reduce the power or your ability to ask, to address new question. And this idea that is invention, event, gesture, means that there is all the time alternative gesture, alternative possibilities. And I think science fiction, in the way that I understand some part of it, would be the sense of the possibility linked to the fragility of a specific situation. But you have first to accept that the situation is a precarious, fragile situation, and even is of our story, when we try to show it as a strong, robust story, is fragile everywhere, and you have a set of other possibilities. It's why I don't think that the modern have just one metaphysic. They have a lot settled. Diderot was a modern, and etc.
Small comment still. I agree, and very Deleuzian gesture. And I think it's also important to stress here that art itself is crucial in how it can kind of traverse all of these different narratives. And I think that is why I was also interested in the way you talked about intelligence in your dino flagellants, sorry. Because what you can do with films like this, with installations like this, you can kind of immediately question the dominant ideas of intelligence, of thinking, of collective action, by kind of showing something which completely does not match with that idea. And that is what I like of contemporary art, and especially the kind of installations that you have been working with. It is, you don't need 15 philosophy books to kind of come to a to work through the idea of modernism, which we also need, of course. I mean, it's my job too. But it's also interesting to come into a space and to see that things happen differently. I mean, that's what I think is also necessary for the debate.
But there is we have to keep a strong modesty for philosophy. Philosophy come all the time with the others. You cannot address philosophical questions if they were not already in process somewhere. I like the phrase of Whitehead that the task of philosophy is to take care of our abstraction. It's a very specific activity, and it doesn't have to found or to pretend to give the sense of other activities. It's an alliance activity. But I think that there is no immediate expression or activity. Abstraction, ideas, sense of possibilities are all the time there. So it's not with philosophy that it began. We all inherit from the gesture of Galileo. You are a philosopher, you are an artist, you don't know anything about history of science. Doesn't matter. We are all transformed by this gesture in a very, and it's our immediate experience. Our immediate experience is full of stories and not just an access to something else. It's full of stories. Galileo is there in our conversation, of course, but it's already there when you go out and take a drink. Newton is there. The history of politics is there. We are what we call immediate experience is never a pure experience. It's a full experience. But I see that.
Your microphone. Yours, Susanne. Thank you. So fantastic. I was almost brain dead when the session began, so very exciting. And I've become a champion of dinoflagellants. And my association of flagellants is very different. I was just thinking of the Spanish Catholic, drenched in blood on the Easter procession. So there you go. There's a big a sort of imaginary effect. But my question to you, Susanne, is about your practice, which I thought was fascinating, what you did to us, because here is this spectacular, very theoretical, you have to drop this crap that you don't know your theory. Wasn't she? It was completely theoretically infused, full of references. I thought that checks, oh, I don't know that one. So I think you need to acquire a little bit more self-confidence there. And then on top of it, you blast us with this totally non-spectacular, subtractive performance, where you evoke depth and immensity and biomass, but taking images away and confronting her with this incredible acoustic space. It really is a becoming imperceptible in its most potent manner. So I really wanted you to say something about this, because of course you are doing it to us. So what was that all about?
Okay. Yes. I mean, first I have to say that this is one of the biggest compliments I ever got in my life, because I've been very much busy with trying to become imperceptible, and that's what you just saw is like one. You know, I'm dissolving in the realm of the dinoflagellates. I want to give up my name and give up this material body. I'm already a cyborg, but so I try very hard. I also, and that's maybe a little bit the link that didn't come across that much, but I think that this has to be done from, let's say, from within. Like, you know, feminist history and arguments were always like you need to renegotiate, which I think has to be done also in terms of like in science and in technology, not only the self, because what is that? But I just wanted to. And I hope that answers a little bit, or because in the morning we had this question where someone was saying like, oh, the personal and the political is not this, you know, is not the issue today. I would say the opposite. The personal and the political became much more the issue of like, you know, Google suggesting you to look at like a pair of shoes just because I assembled some salt on my shoes. So you're already having like all these algorithms that observe you before you observe you, or if someone remembers this film by Spike Jonze called Her, this singularity is exactly the problem, because you think like, my iPhone is really comforting me with my meditation lectures, and oh wow, it's so personal. And then you recognize, oh, it's not, you know, I'm actually not the person. It's like 5,000 next to me that have had the same labor force into the click thing, and then, so it's just like the frontiers have changed, and I think like, you know, we all kind of like see that science still very much is at the frontier, and also education is very much on the frontier. Who has access to which knowledge? Who assembles all the medical data from gene sequencing, who assembles all the, I mean, Google, it became already then this hashtag that everyone uses, but no one actually thinks through the consequences, which are new forces of colonialism, and they're much more like digested and in our skins, and where we, you know, we need to also constantly like wake up, because we don't even recognize how much the language and our daily tools and habits have already taken this in and changed us, mutated us. So I'm kind of like sharing this struggle of like, okay, how to get out of this, how to, you know, radically listen to biomass, which actually when you do that, when you try to scan certain parts of biomass, is very interesting how you get to the borders of technology, because to really 3D scan a lichen or some of my dinoflagellates is really, really difficult. The gene sequencing of the dinoflagellates is the most complex on the earth. So when I was talking to these two people that have the supercomputers in China, like they were like, yeah, the dinoflagellates, they are like our, you know, that's what we have to go for. They're the most complicated, and they don't even have a brain. So I think this, for me, is like a way to try to shake things a little bit up, because we've become too comfortable also with this hashtag decolonizing that sometimes drives me crazy, because the people that use this word the most, they like, I mean, I don't want to go into bad naming, but it's like very, you know, all these hashtags, they become so easy. that in this accelerated times, where even like we have to be aware of the hashtag before it's hashtagged. Maybe I got lost now, but.
So, and Didier, wonderful, and I really enjoyed particularly the ending with what I consider an assemblage of great allies, the critical perspectivists, that indeed do run from the 18th century empiricism through to the Deleuze of situated knowledges. And I come from the multiple cultures, not only of this particular philosophy, but the radical epistemologies of feminism and postcolonialism, race theory, and indigenous theories, which have always been situated in perspectives. So I think it is the time to strike alliances between the different forms of perspectivism, different forms of radical empiricism, and bring in not only what classical philosophy has given us, and you as a French-trained person, which I am as well, did that very admirably, but remember that a lot of radical epistemologies are doing exactly that, being very perspectival. We are speaking from somewhere specific. And des scholars with whom I've had the pleasure to work several times, Philippe, who has the chair of Lévi-Strauss at the Collège de France in passing, does fabulous work on how the nature-culture distinction is purely Western, and most cultures under the world don't have that distinction. So not only is nature a historical construct, but it is very culture-specific. And cultures that don't have the nature-culture distinction we call animistic or primitive, quite simply, barbarians. And yet in the Anthropocene, if we want to draw inspiration about how to think a continuum, we have to look seriously at non-Western epistemologies and different knowledge production systems. And this is why Achille Mbembe says that the Anthropocene is the becoming indigenous of Western philosophy. And I think welcome. So great alliance, and I wanted to thank you for it.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, something you might not be able to do completely, but there is a 12-hour documentary running in parts by the filmmaker Ulrike Ottinger, where she weaves in 3 different stories from Humboldt, from Camisos, and her own visit to the Bering Strait region. And I think this is exactly where you see how pre-Western thinking, pre-Western ways of being are still somehow preserved and passed over, mostly because it's utmost a necessity there. She was last week here and told this story how after the Soviet Union broke down, the old people in these remote areas had to bring back their knowledge, and they became the most important people in the community again because they knew how to survive, because there were no more ships and airplanes coming with food and other goods. And so all of a sudden they had to fall back on very ancient traditions, which reminds us quite strongly about how recent, in a way, these strange concepts have been introduced and also taken over massively. We almost forgotten for a big part where we came from, in a way. So I think this is also a good moment to maybe open up for questions from the audience.
Thank you so much for all the lectures, were amazing. So my question is about the last lecture by Didier, and I'm going to address it to Rosie. And it's about, it's very interesting, this idea of using, leaving out the representation and ontologies and focus on the gesture. So in this sense, with the invention of nature, of course, there's a lot of other terms, for example, the idea of minority. So I'd like to ask to Rosie, within your field, what is going on with this term minority, in the sense that if all minorities together is probably what's left is actually minority. And in terms of really the use or the undoing of the concept of nature through also this gesture of certain terms that we still use.
Thank you. I think the reason why I'm very interested by the question of gesture is also due to, it's not really fixed for me, this question, is that you have now in the philosophical scene coming back to the question of the diversity of ontologies. Also in Descola, in Viveros de Castro, to say that a good way to attribute consistency to beings is to treat the kind of ontology that they have. And I think it was a very important claim to say it's not representation, it's not a way of speaking and theorizing about beings, but it has statue of beings. It has this pretension to say what are the kind of beings that we have. But I think it's also a trap, because I think that for me, abstraction, ideas, representation, if you, I would focus more on abstraction, are mainly gesture. And when you say gesture, it means that it is operative. And to understand it, you have to see how it works, in which level, in which environment it works. And the same abstraction in another environment can become something completely different. So my claim is a very pragmatic one. I'm more pragmatist than metaphysician in this way. My question is, why you need a specific concept in a specific situation? And how, there is a beautiful phrase in Whitehead's philosophy, say, if you don't take care of your abstractions, and I think abstractions are everywhere, if you don't take care of it, they become furies, machine of desertification. And it's why it's a very important for me task, is to see what is the operation that an abstraction does, and if it forgets, and if you forget the kind of operation, it becomes a tout-terrain. What is the phrase in English? Tout-terrain. It goes everywhere, you know, directly. And this becomes really very dangerous, because you lose the specificity of it. And I would add on this way, just before I give the micro, what I would call minority in this way, minoritarian knowledge practice, are practice that cultivate their dependency, not their autonomy, but their dependency. What you require to say something, what you require to live, what do you need for an action or for a situation. So it's a sense of the dependencies, where the majority in Deleuzian style is something that doesn't celebrate his dependence or present himself as it doesn't require anything else to exist than himself. You know?
I wanted Didier to go first, because I think you framed the question very much in Didier's language. I don't think I even pronounce the term minorities. I don't work on minorities. And if I do, I work on minoritarian, majoritarian, nomadic, yes, rhizomatic, within the ethical scheme proposed by Deleuze. In fact, the advantage of situated knowledges, critical perspectivism, is that you can really speak about situated, differential, materially embedded differences. And they're not better or worse, plus or minus. They are otherwise other. And the problem is that these different differences are framed in a political system where power differentials come in of the quantitative kind. Women are 52% of the world population. We're still a minority. Figure that one out. And I think that is the game between qualitative and quantitative differences. But I think the advantage of a material vitalist ontology, whether you do it with Whitehead, Deleuze, Spinoza, all the different philosophers, is they allow us to position, situate difference, otherwise other, without a normative system. Notice also that, and I think we have that in common, as I think we are an assemblage of allies, that we have all of these theories in our own history. So we can go with Viveo de Castro and Descola and go indigenous. We can also go to Leibniz, Hume, and Spinoza and say, we have all of this in Western philosophy, so how come everything is about Kant and Hegel and the eternal Nazi goat of Heidegger? How about we always have those, and we can't go back to the minoritarian tradition within our own philosophy? And why is Spinoza a minority when he is the most spectacularly relevant thinker? And why is an unrepentant Nazi Heidegger the majority? Why? What is that all about? So it's that kind of ethical coding of system. And I think for your own institutional career, if I can speak as a professor for a moment, there's a lot to be gained by actually going back to the future and say, all we need to do is go back to the Stoics, to Epicurus, to Spinoza, to Hume. We have all of this in our culture, and we just haven't activated it. I think it's a different strategy to come to the same effect. But I think on this, everybody has things to say. So make sure Susanne also speaks.
Yeah. You want to add something?
No, I mean, that's...
Go.
Okay, yeah, then I'm driven by the currents and I go with the dinos. But I very much like that, because that also is that's also where art's role can be productive. I also think that art's role can also be constructive, but art is like is something where you can animate. I mean, you know, with programs, with graphics, but also in sculpture. When you know, the early forms of art were all like giving life to something that's non-life. So I also see a lot of potential in terms of activating energy, because part of this, maybe I'm repeating myself, is that it makes you feel dumb and hopeless. But so the first thing I also think is that we need to be aware that that already is a part of the system to, yeah, maybe to minoritize or to put again outside what we actually learning from history should put more into the inside or focus on in terms of preciousness or fragility or so yeah, I like this, that this can be like an affirmative thing, animation.
Hello. So thank you, Susanne, for your work. I really liked and enjoyed your talk and your work. It was very inspiring. So I have a question for you. Well, actually, your work, as we also talked about yesterday a little bit, very much reminded me of Deleuze's work on Bacon, and particularly the expression about Bacon's figures and how through painting the screen, Bacon is rendering the invisible forces visible. But now in your work, you also talked about forces and also about listening. And at some point, you also talked about listening to hydrophones. And you also talked about Barad's interaction. And now I'm interested in the notion of listening here. And I wonder if you're kind of in your work recapturing the unheard voices, unheard forces heard through interactively rendering forces visible in your work. Or maybe you would want to elaborate on this, because I'm now interested in this notion. Or how can you further stretch this interaction as a politics of inclusion and make many other minoritarian or precarious elements or forces heard in your work? Thank you.
Well, maybe you can answer. But yeah, no, I think it is connected, because if you say that you want to rather empower something and enable something, then you automatically become a little bit imperceptible, or you have to step back. Like I come from let's say a farm. We were kind of like trained to first take care of the animals and then the human, which I sometimes now recognize as something that's weird, because it doesn't fit into the usual scheme of like how you navigate in life. But for example, in some of these things, when I record, I first have to to actually cross this border. Like, for example, my first experiments with a hydrophone were like a nightmare because they were also in one of the ecosystems of the dinoflagellates called Mosquito Bay. Mosquito Bay for the actual problem you have with mosquitoes. This was at a time when we were not aware that the biomass, especially the insects, are so run down. But so I had to fight massively with the mosquitoes, which made it nearly impossible for me to actually work with this hydrophone. So you're immediately, let's say, you are confronted with the obstacles in this on your own body or with your own position. And I think this is where I think this interaction of Karen Bra is maybe the most uncomfortable, but also the most effective. When some of the first biohackers were also like, oh yeah, you want to work with these creatures that glow, but you are like the first one that agitates them. And I was like, yeah, it's true. If I really want to experience it, I have to see myself as this first body that agitates these clusters. So I hope that this kind of like answers, but it's sort of like what's called a feedback loop in artificial intelligence, for example, that you are immediately like hitting on your own singularity, meaning like you have to take the same disadvantages or obstacles or problems in the case of the mosquitoes or the technological limits. So I'd say I encounter that, and I also try to make some of this struggle or share some of this struggle, because that's maybe more important than the glorification that we also had in the morning. But it's very easy to constantly like look at this like very optimistic, but only in a way where you have to see that you still have to go for like a lot of information, because the image you have is not full. It is constantly incomplete. So that is something that you look through the microscopic image and you're like, oh, but this is like so much defined by like my situation now, being in this mood, looking through the sample, being like 10 days old or being like 1 day old, or the actual functioning of the lenses that take on the sample's image. So you, on the technological side, as on the side of all the other parameters that come in the laboratory experiment, for example, I think there's a beauty in recognizing all the other parameters out there and this limit of like narrowing them down and abstracting and coming to something like, oh, this is then where I can assemble the pattern. I hope that answered a little bit. No?
Can I add something to it? I think that both the sound fragments that we've heard today, I mean also the Justin Bennett thing that I brought in, and your fragments were, I think they were both amazing also because you have no clue what is going on there. It's just not, I mean, when we read Deleuze, of course, we see that he's writing about the scream of Pope Innocentius, and you see a big mouth still, and you can understand that there's an enormous force kind of involved in this. But the nice thing about music especially, or about sound, about sonic experiments, and especially when you talk about boreholes or about deep sea life, I mean, no clue what is going on there, is that this sound becomes such an interesting cluster of forces, as if a 1,000 tiny mouths are screaming at you or screaming at death, but you have no clue where it's coming from or where it's going, and you just feel the kind of force. I think it's a very powerful recording also in that sense, and very much in line with kind of the idea of what art can do. Kind of, you feel the power, you feel that there's something immensely important going on down there. I just don't understand what it is about, but it must be very important.
I wondered if you could say a little bit about the scientific gaze and what it introduces. So how is it different, this kind of scientific separation of humans and nature, from, say, the religious separation of humans and nature? So what specifically is the scientific perspective bringing in? And I wondered, in a way, around, think about investigation. There's this horrible term that's called science capital that's evolved out of the UK, where separating culture and science, and imagining that if we only had enough science capital, we'd do better in the world. But it does make me wonder, what does being able to get close to these things that you're scanning, or wherever they come from, I don't know, enable you to see in ways that perhaps people who don't have these tools are not seeing them? So I'm just kind of interested in your practice, or your practices, and the kind of difference between religion and what science is doing in separating human and nature.
Thank you very much. It's a very difficult question, and I think it can be linked to the last book of Bruno Latour, which is, what is again? Facing Gaia? Yeah, Facing Gaia, where he tried to see the kind of codependence between these very different stories. But from my point of view, or the way by which I address this question, is the fact that science. I will say in a different, begin differently. When I was interested by this gesture, bifurcation, localization, etc., as soon as you question this kind of gesture, you have already a lot of literature about it. And particularly in French tradition, the lectures are really easy, are really common. Bifurcation is another name for dualism, of the modern dualism. And I thought, when I read this kind of interpretation of the story of the modern, I all the time thought, it's wrong. The dualism is not the root of the problem. The dualism is a secondary effect of the gesture. Moderns are dualist because they are dependent of a specific gesture. And the dualism, all the debate between how can I be linked to the, how can I know something about the reality, what some French philosopher for the moment call correlationism, how your experience can be, can say something about the reality, etc., is a huge amount of false problems, because you don't see the operation. If you have the operation, you understand that there is no difficulties about that. And secondly, the localization, when you check for the localization, you directly come from a Bergsonian tradition. We are spatializing. There is something in our brain, in your mental representation that produces spatialization. So I think that make the specificity of this gesture, because they, in the same time, attribute to a specific kind of relation of knowledge to the scientifics, the one who have the right to address this question. And if you have this, if you master this operation, you have all the secondary effects. So you don't have to question politics, because you have already the politics inside your operation. So I don't think that, or at least there would be a story of religion practice in the same way. The ritual, and interrogate the ritual and the links between rituals, because you have a practical situation there. And you can articulate the story of of religion through the question of how you make the ritual, what kind of gesture are there, and the representation may become a bit later. But I think it's two relatively different stories, but they produce by their. As soon as you forget the operation, of course, it makes a kind of a partage of competency. Science would treat nature, religion would treat soul, and politics would treat the human behaviors. But all these stories can be linked to a very strange invention and a specific invention. I think that there is also one point that maybe should be mentioned, is the fact that radical perspectivism, critical perspectivism, is not a way to come back to early, before the invention of nature. It's not to come back somewhere. I think we are today in a kind of revival of exotic pictures, exotic behavior. We think that someone would have a more original way of being, and that the pre-modern were maybe more correct in their relation of nature. It's not at all my point. My point is that we inherit from this gesture. We have to give sense to this gesture because they produce also something. And we never come back after the invention of this kind of new scene. So the revival, the coming back is all the time an addition in the future, never a way back or go and become the others, you know?
Just a footnote, because it's a day of death and life. When Foucault writes his analysis of the scientific method in the early Foucault, which is my favorite Foucault, in a book called The Birth of the Clinic, is talking about the birth of modern medicine, the biosciences, in fact, biopower. And he points out that all of the knowledge that science had in the early days about it, and even today, the body, for instance, knowledge about human biology, was drawn from corpses. And if anybody has stood in awe in front of Rembrandt's painting or the anatomy lesson would know that biology, our knowledge about life and living systems, is an art of the corpse, and very complicated with like where to find them, how to get them, when to operate on them. The anatomy theatres, of which De Waag in Amsterdam is a very, very still existing model, but there's the one in Bologna, there's one in Padua, there's no university in Europe that does not have this theatre where bios meets Thanatos in the birth of modern science. It's to talk about a killing gaze. But things are getting better. My university tells me that at the medical faculty in Utrecht, for the first time now, anatomy lessons will be taught without any body or corpse. Everything is computer simulation. Entire generations will be trained on simulated bodies. I asked, what is the gender ethnicity of those bodies? I got the usual laugh, 80% white and male.
Well, on that note, we are going to close off this session. I would like to thank all the 4 speakers with a warm applause.